Good afternoon and welcome everyone. For those of you who maybe not be from UF, this forum is meant to facilitate interdisciplinary discussion of state-of-the-art research that has as its primary goal the elucidation of the complex relationships between language, brain, and behavior. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing from Dr. Denise Klein, who will be speaking to us about the effects of linguistic experience on brain structure and function. Dr. Klein is an associate professor in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery at McGill University and a neuropsychologist at the Montreal Neurological Institute and Hospital. She's also currently serving as the director of the Center for Research on Brain, Language, and Music, which is a very important and highly productive research group in Montreal that has many top-notch scientists. Dr. Klein is known internationally for her work on critical period phenomena and neuroplasticity as it relates to language. Her laboratory uses a highly integrated combination of behavioral and functional neuroimaging techniques to unravel how language influences the brain, cognitive functions, and learning. Her work has appeared in many top-tier journals, including the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences and the Journal of Neuroscience. So it's really an honor to have Dr. Klein here with us. So please give her a warm welcome.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to share my work. I wasn't sure about the audience, so I've made it quite general, presenting sort of elements of my work just to give you a snippet of the sorts of things that we're doing. I'm trying to look for the where to advance the slides. I see they're below here. I'm trying to get rid of the...
Could you use the enter button? No.
Ah, there you go. Okay. So this is Brenda Milner on her 100th birthday. And I've had the pleasure of working with her or being inspired by her for the last 30 years. And this is her and I in the 1990s when I came to the Montreal Neurological Institute. And one of the things that I had the privilege of being able to do is to look inside the human brain using PET scans. So when the tools and techniques were emerging, to be able to get a view of what was happening around language organization. And so most of you probably, or a lot of you might not realize that it's only quite recently that we're able to look inside the living human brain. And that even until quite recently, we had to rely on brain operations or brain stimulation to try and understand how language was organized. So this is an example of Penfield's brain map, stimulating the brain. So pre-MRI, this is what they did. You can see to the posterior and the anterior speech region with stimulation where speech arrest was noted. But I'm going to show you how we have used brain imaging as a window into understanding brain organization. And so early when I arrived at the Neuro, the work of Peterson and other, Marcus Rakel, they were using PET scans, and this was one of the first scans where they showed that you could develop very specialized tasks that could isolate different parts of the brain. And so, for example, if you did contrasts, you could isolate the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the area for speaking, and the area for generating. Now, this was done in English, and having been born in South Africa, where there are 11 official languages, and having done my PhD on bilingualism, I was wondering what would happen when you looked at this question in multiple languages. And when I arrived in Quebec, I realized that there was an equally interesting linguistic environment here in which to address these questions. So My first question, this was with PET scans long time ago, was just to see how are two languages organized in the brain? What happens when you scan people whose mother tongue is English, who are highly proficient in French, and you get them to generate, so instead of the Peterson task where they were generating verbs, here I got them to generate synonyms. These were people right-handed. They were highly proficient in English and French, and they learned French around the age of 6. And what you saw was strikingly similar activity, left lateralized, localized to the anterior part of the brain, and strikingly similar whether they were making the search in their second language, French, or in their first language, English. And when you subtracted the two from each other, this frontal lobe peak disappeared, sort of indicating common regions for lexical search and retrieval in the two languages. I didn't make much of it at the time, but this is the left caudate, an area that has become quite a popular region for discussion related to cognitive control and other aspects of bilingual switching. So after we did that, we thought, well, English and French are quite similar and they learned the two languages quite early in life. What about languages that are more distinct, like Mandarin and English? What would these people look like if you scanned them? So we took, again, a PET scan. We took native speakers of Mandarin, all pretty fluent in English. They'd come to McGill to study. They learned English around the ages of 16 to 18. And again, strikingly similar activity, irrespective of whether they were speaking their second, this time English was the second language. And when you subtracted the two, the frontal lobe peaks disappeared, suggesting overlap between these two regions. And Robert Sartori and Laura Petito showed that this was the same if you did the task in people who were born deaf. Again, so across modality, this left frontal region was there if you looked at sign language, Quebec Sign Language or American Sign Language, or if you looked at native signers versus spoken signers. And one of the things that we noticed in the study that we did where we looked at English and French is that, so this is just to show you, this is the same cut across 3 different tasks. This is what happens when people generate synonyms. This is the region that's active when people generate rhymes, like tactical, practical. This is like beverage, drink. And this is what happens when people make an across language search, like house, maison. And what's interesting about this condition, so in all of them, irrespective of whether the search is based on semantics, phonology, or an across, or within versus an across language search, the same left frontal region is active. What's noticed here is increased activity in the left basal ganglia in the condition in which they're required to make the response into their non-native language. So in all these conditions, they're producing the response in English, but in this condition, they're articulating in French. And what we saw was strikingly similar activity across all the conditions. This is generating synonyms in French minus English, and the frontal lobe peaks gone, and just the activity in the basal ganglia. This is repeating words in French minus repeating in English, just the activity in the basal ganglia. This is translating minus rhyme, so the frontal lobe peak is not evident, just the activity in the basal ganglia, and the same before the translation minus repeat. And we thought that this area is involved in the increased articulatory demands involved in speaking a foreign language. And you see it active in diseases or disorders of language like foreign accent syndrome, where people often have stroke to the left basal ganglia. And we've kind of been thinking about it. It's interesting. So you can acquire the lexical search and retrieval, you can acquire up to quite a late age. You can acquire very high ability, but it's quite difficult to acquire a native-like pronunciation when you learn a language later in life. And on some level, this is probably related to the brain development, but I think it might also be related in some way to identity and difficulty in letting go of one's accent. I found it interesting. I saw the snippet about Stephen Hawking, and even though his voice simulator could have been changed later in life, he chose to keep the robotic voice that he had because it was part of his identity. So this is what we have found up until now. And so I've been talking about my interest in looking at what happens when we learn something from birth, when nothing is there, versus what happens when we learn something in the context of an already established system. And the sorts of scenarios I've been using to look at this are the question of bilingualism, because we can look at 2 languages from birth or 1 language from birth, learning a second language later, high degrees of proficiency versus low. We can look at questions related to the context in which people learn languages. So this is a very important opportunity, not only to ask questions about how 2 languages are organized in the brain, but bilingualism offers the opportunity of understanding the question of brain plasticity. Another population that I've used to study this question is international adoptees. And here we have the opportunity of looking at what happens very early in the first year of life. When we look at bilingualism, most people learn the second language, aside from simultaneous bilinguals. People have a hard time telling you exactly when they learned their second language. But in international adoptees, we know exactly when they were adopted. We know exactly when the first language was cut off and they learned a second first language. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of this work with Lara Pierce and Fred Genesee in that context. And then the third scenario that I've looked at is people who have learned sign language. And this is work that I did with Rachel Maybury, because here, unlike the first 2 scenarios where a first language was learned within the first year of life, in people with sign language, you can get people who learn their first language after several months or quite late in life, either because they're born to hearing parents who don't quite get on to working out what strategy to teach them, or because they're in an outlying area and don't get access to proper instruction straight away. So this is what happens not to a second language, but when the first language is learned several years later. So I'm going to show you some elements of this work. And in all these instances, I'm not looking at children, I'm looking at the developed brain, the adult, but I look back at their developmental history to see what happened in infancy and how this influenced brain organization. So one study that we did with the bilinguals was we looked at brain structure and language learning. So we took all the studies that we had done for many of the functional studies, and we took the T1, the anatomical scans for those people. And what we did is we measured cortical thickness. So we measured the distance between the outer and inner layers, the peel structure. And what we did, we measured this across the whole brain. And what we found was that bilinguals had a thicker left frontal cortex than monolinguals. So they had a greater absolute focal cortical thickness in the left inferior frontal gyrus. But when we broke it down, so this was about 160 participants, and we looked late bilinguals, so people who acquired the second language after age 7 had the thickest left frontal cortex. Early bilinguals between 3 and 6 had a slightly thicker left frontal cortex. But simultaneous bilinguals looked no different to monolinguals. There was no significant cortical thickness difference between simultaneous and monolinguals. And this might seem counterintuitive, but how we saw it is a bit like wiring a room. When you wire a room from the beginning, whether it's 2 languages or 2 chords or 1, you have the optimal sort of organization to set this up elegantly. But if you wire the room and then later you decide to add a few chords, later in life, you have to kind of bulk up in order to, you have this bulking up of the chords in the same way, thicker organization. And we saw this in a regression where we saw that the later that they acquired it, the thicker the left frontal cortex. This was something that we had noted on anatomical measurements. But what it sort of struck me when I looked at the simultaneous versus the monolinguals was that this is something to do with very, very early in life. And I've become increasingly sort of struck by that these first 3 years of life or first years of life are really what's critical for a lot about brain organization. And this work was advanced by the research that we were doing with international adoptees. So here we had the opportunity of looking at 3 different groups of individuals. We looked at them, they were all around the age between about 12 and 17, all mother tongue French when we saw them, no conscious recollection of speaking Chinese in the adoptee group. And we compared them, so these were people born in China who were adopted within the first 24 months into Quebec and were currently monolingual French speakers. And we compared them to a group of monolingual French speakers who spoke only French. And essentially, behaviorally, the 2 groups are exactly the same. They speak only French. Neither have any conscious knowledge of Mandarin, but these ones had been exposed to it early in life. And then we looked at a 3rd group where those born to Chinese parents who continued to speak Chinese, but also learned French and were using French at school. And we wanted to see what happened to the Chinese, to the lost language. Would there still be traces left in the brain of the lost language? And what was happening when all these groups were processing French? And to look at the lost language, we used a task that I had used a long time ago for a different study, where we had used tone discrimination. And the reason you can use this is because Mandarin carries, the tones carry meaning. And so if you give, well, I'll first do a little experiment with you. I'm going to ask you to listen and tell me if 2 sounds sound the same or different.
爬 踏
Who thinks that's the same? Put your hand up. All right, I'll play it for you again.
爬 踏
Okay, so that's different. Listen to this one.
床 床
So that's different.
蠢 蠢
That's the same. Okay, so it's actually not that difficult to do, but to native speakers of Mandarin, these carry meaning. And to non-native speakers, these are simply, one makes a judgment simply based on the acoustics. And in a long time ago, we looked at 2 groups, a Mandarin group and an English group, and we saw that the Mandarin group activated the left hemisphere when doing this task, and the English group activated the right hemisphere when they were performing this task. So you can do the task to the same level of success, but linguistically relevant properties of the stimuli determine which neural mechanisms will be engaged. And so we then used a similar task with our 3 groups. And so we gave the Mandarin French the tones to discriminate. And what you see is that they activate the auditory cortex bilaterally, stronger on the left than on the right. And we then looked at the monolingual French speakers who have no knowledge of tone, and they look very different because they're doing this task non-linguistically. And they do it to the same level of success, but they activate very different regions. So now the question is, what's happening to the adoptee group? If they are monolingual, like the monolingual French, they should look like this. And if they have retained traces left in the brain, they should look like the bilinguals. And this is despite the fact that they have no conscious recollection of tone, they still look like the bilinguals. So many years later, without continued use of that language, their brain patterns are still looking quite similar. And when you overlap the bilinguals and the international adoptees, the peaks are very similar. And if you look at the age at which they've adopted, so you take all the adoptees, what you see is that the more they were exposed to the tone, the more they activate the left hemisphere. So the later they were adopted, the more exposure they got, the more they processed these stimuli linguistically. So we then asked, you know, how does that first language serve as a scaffolding for the second language or for the other language? What would we see when all these people are processing French? So we gave them all a non-word phonological working memory task, which had the phonology of French, and it was a 0 back, 1 back, or 2 back task. And we wanted to see what was happening with phonological working memory. And we gave it to the same 3 groups. So the monolingual, these are French only, so they speak only French, activate the bilateral insular left to a stronger degree. Now, this is a region I had been showing you before is often quite activated in language tasks. We then wanted to see what would happen when the adoptees do this task. And again, they look quite different from the monolingual. So they are essentially monolingual French, but you can see they're activating the insular only just to a very tiny degree here, but they're activating the temporal lobes much more. And they again look like the bilinguals. So despite the fact that they are monolingual French now, their brains still look like the bilingual participants. And when we did a comparison of the monolinguals to the bilinguals, it's the left insular that's active. When we looked at the monolinguals compared to the adoptees, so what was more active in those who were French from birth with no additional language, it was this left insular. But what we did see is that when you look at the task that involves the highest cognitive load. So one thing I want to say, they all did the task to the same degree of success. But in order to do the task to the same degree of success, the monolinguals, the Chinese French bilinguals and the international adoptees activate a whole lot of additional cognitive control regions, which the monolinguals don't do. And I actually think this is quite an important lesson, because despite the fact that all these 3 groups come to the classroom or come to the situation as speakers of French, their language learning experience has impacted their brains very differently. And these regions develop at different rates. And this could have implications for the classroom, because I think that everybody who speaks the same language, that their brains will be similar. But the type of experience that they bring to bear from very early in life could actually have a profound impact, and different tasks or different cognitive loads could impact how much of the brain or what parts of the brain they need to recruit in order to be successful with that task. So I'm going to show you now some work that we did with Rachel on delayed first language acquisition, because in the others I've focused on the early learning, of the role of that very early learning, which a lot of people had mentioned before. I like the idea of Patricia Kuhl, and I think Janet Work has also mentioned this, about children being citizens of the world, turning their head to the sounds of all language, and then losing that in order to become specialists of a language. Well, what happens when that first language is not learnt during that first critical time in life? So here what we did, Rachel had done some work where she had looked at grammatical judgment in normal controls, people who learned to sign early, people who learned to speak early, and then people who learned to sign late. So what you can see behaviorally, those that sign and speak early look quite similar, whereas those who sign late look quite different. So we took the same participants and we gave them a brain imaging scan. And what we did is we divided them into native, early, and late. So the native were those that learned from birth. The early were those that learned between 3 and 7, and the late were those that learned after 7. And here you can see the frontal lobe peak and the occipital peak and the percent bold signal change. So what you can see is that the native activate this left insular region to a higher degree, the early almost the same, but the late have a reversed pattern. So learning the language after age 7, they don't recruit this left hemisphere route that I have been showing is so critical for the development of language. And they rely on the visual form or the visual stimulus in order to make their response. And what Rachel has shown, I'm going to just show you here that in the regression, you see that the earlier they learn it, the more they activate the left insula, and the later they learn it, the more they activate the left occipital cortex. And what Rachel has shown is that these people, so what I'm saying here is that in the absence of learning this language very early in life, this left hemisphere route that's so important gets used perhaps for some other purpose, and that they rely much more on the surface features in order to perform the task. And these people who learn late tend not to learn secondary language skills. So reading is much more difficult, and so are second languages, learning second languages. So when you learn really early sign language as well, you can learn or build on the structure in order to perform successfully. But if you learn late, things get rerouted. And I think this has implications for things like cochlear implants and things like that, where it is probably quite important that these children are exposed whichever way is possible to language as early as possible in whichever form, so that the language system can start developing, because we've seen from both all of these studies as a body of knowledge that the brain seems to need these things from really early in life in order to develop the complex connections that are necessary for good language ability. So I've been speaking about age of acquisition, but one of the things that I wanted to also talk about is whether there might be some individual differences in learning success and failure. And so another part of my work has been interested in biomarkers, neural biomarkers for predicting learning success. And so one of the studies that we did is we took, we wrapped our scans around an intensive language training course that was happening at McGill. So we scanned participants at the beginning of the 12-week course. Then participants, they were monolingual English speakers, underwent 12 weeks of intensive language training, 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. And then we scanned them at the end of the training course. And what we did is we took their speech samples and we related them to their brain at the beginning of the course. And we looked to see, were there patterns in their brain that predicted learning success. And this was the work of my student Xiao Chen Chai, who's currently back at McGill on faculty. And what she did is she used resting state connectivity. And what she did, so she seeded the left insula, this area I've told you is really important for language. She seeded it, and she found that those individuals with stronger connectivity between this left insular region and the left STG, those with stronger connectivity showed the most improvement in lexical retrieval, whereas a different group, those with stronger connectivity between the left visual word form area and a different part of the left STG showed predicted reading speed improvement. And these weren't the same individuals from the two. So it's not one individual that's good at everything. There are different strengths and weaknesses or different connectivity patterns for different individuals, which might explain people sort of throw away lines that they are a more visual learner or they're a more auditory learner or something like that. Different patterns of connectivity predicted different learning success. We've also been trying to relate this to anatomical measures. Here, the left long segment predicted improvement, lexical retrieval improvement as well in those individuals. So I don't think my kids always thought that I was lazy, and that's why I never learned French or learned it very well. But I do think that there are some people that are better at acquiring the accent of another language. And this is some of this work that we have been focusing on. We are now doing additional studies where we've looking at predispositions. And here in some of the work that some of my students have done, here is something where Jonathan Birkin showed that simultaneous bilinguals have greater gray matter density in the putamen than sequential bilinguals. So this is an age of acquisition effect. So but what he also found is that later learners with better accents have greater gray matter density than those with worse. So the better the accent, the greater the gray matter density. So both our age of acquisition and our predispositions may influence our brain organization. I've done some work recently with Virginia Penhune and Lucia Vaquero, comparing musicians and bilinguals. It was very hard to find bilinguals, so we looked at the additive effect of musicianship on bilingualism, because we were interested in this question of whether there were differences whether a common sensory motor experience might give rise to similar patterns in the brain, that it wasn't related to language, what was related to language and what was related to just general exposure of sensory motor systems. And what we did find is that there were differences between musicians and bilinguals, that it wasn't the same parts of the brain that showed difference that were affected, even though they both involve sensory motor experience. One thing to focus on is that musicians only learn another instrument or even one instrument after about the age of 4, whereas we learn language from birth. This could also be related in some way to questions about critical periods or optimal periods. So I've been speaking so far about what happens when we learn something from birth versus when we learn something when there's an already established system. And I just thought it would be interesting, because I spent half my life as a clinician, I wanted to sort of show how the two can feed into each other, and that questions that we ask in basic science, when we least expect them, become actually relevant for clinical purposes. And so I presented my work to the surgeons, because I had shown you that I had seen such clear results, left lateralized and localized results. I presented my work to the surgeons at a neurosurgical day, and they started sending me their patients. And this, as an example, is a patient they sent me who was an interpreter. She had temporal lobe epilepsy. You can see a little bit that the ventricles are enlarged from a long time of seizures. We scanned her in Spanish, French, and English. Her 2 early languages were Spanish and French, and English she had learned later. But some of the work that we had done on translation, or looking at the L1 and L2, has allowed us to see patients who come to the clinic with all different languages. We know we can use translation instead of, we get people who speak Yiddish, but we can present something to them in English and they produce the response in Yiddish. In this instance, we had a patient who spoke Inuktitut, and we gave them the stimuli in English and they produced the response in Inuktitut, and then the surgeon did a clipping of an arteriovenous malformation. So all this work that I'd done on bilingualism actually became the tasks that I used for pre-surgical mapping, understanding where language was lateralized and localized, helped us to develop a body of knowledge for pre-surgical mapping, so that patients started to get sent with brain tumors where we would map where zones are that were important for language. A huge part of what people complain about in life when they're losing language is word finding. So synonym generation tasks or language generation tasks are very relevant. And so this is a patient that would have previously been inoperable, where they could be either done awake during surgery, or we could scan them and map the proximity. So here you can see how close this is. So this patient had the operation with the surgeon trying to get as close as they could to that region without damaging language. This is a different patient with a different type of lesion. And you can see why you would need to do it individually in each patient, because the lesions push the tumors, push the activity in different ways. What we can do is we can provide this in 3-dimensional space to the surgeon with the vessels so that they can plan the resection before the operation. And we can tell patients what risk they might have to language. So this is something that developed out of a purely basic science protocol. And I've scanned over 1,000 patients now for pre-surgical mapping using very similar paradigm to what we developed with the healthy controls. I also wanted to say that despite all these measures, one thing that I'm really obsessed with is careful observations of behavior, because I think that all these measurements that you can get from big databases, unless you link them with behavior, you may not know what these what the changes in thickness or any of these things are related to. One final sort of element that I wanted to speak about has become a new interest of mine is speech samples. Because when we were doing the learning study, one of the things that we did is we obtained speech samples before and after the participants underwent the intensive language training study. And it's those measurements that we have used quite successfully to be able to relate to brain function and brain structure. But also because as I was driving home one day, I was listening to the radio and I heard quite an intriguing program where they were talking about near imperceptible signs of speech problems as being the sounding alarm before a disease manifests itself. And they talked about Muhammad Ali and how signs of his Parkinson's was observed even at the height of his career before he developed disease. And this was when he was in top fighting shape. And they showed how somebody had analyzed his speech samples during specific periods and how the vowel space had changed across his speech and also his speech rate. And that automated technology could be used to study these speech samples to detect developmental and neurological impairment. And one of the things that I'd found difficult about our study where we had used speech samples with the healthy controls is that it was hard to decide what features of the speech sample we should use to relate to the brain. And so I started working with a postdoctoral fellow to develop AI or machine learning models to see if you could differentiate elements of people's speech based on these learning models. And so this is work with Peter Donhauser, who is actually living in Germany, and we're working remotely with each other now. And so what he did is he took 300 speech samples that we had, 150 young and 150 old, and he trained the machine to detect the difference between young and old. So the young are blue and the old. So this is the training set. And what you can see is that the machine can very readily sift speech samples into young and old. And then what he did is he took neuropsychological variables, so fluid cognition, introversion and extroversion, and crystallized cognition. And these are the young, the blue are the young, and the orange are the old. And again, the speech samples differentiate the differences between the two groups very readily. And so we've now been using these to try and see if we can detect neurological disease. And one of the features that we're also focusing on is accent, because it's very difficult to tell whether a second language learner has an impairment versus whether they have. So our knowledge also with second language learning is being implemented into the model so that we can differentiate second language learners from impaired learners. And so this is what we're doing. We're taking speech samples, we're using algorithms to detect differences, we're relating this to the brain, to treatments, to genes, and applying this to different neurological disorders. And we're trying to use a disease agnostic approach and deep learning to discover subtle features from the data. So that's really just an overview. I've spoken only about my own work. This is the work of my students and I. There are obviously many people in the field doing beautiful work that link to all these studies or that are part of the body of knowledge of bilingualism and of speech learning. But this is what I know best, so I stuck to that. So if you have any questions or any discussion, I'll welcome that. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you.
Thank you so much.